Hi, my name is Corey Reeser, and I will be doing this pedagogy chapter review on chapter 19, which is standardization and control. So the learning objective for this presentation is that by the end of the presentation, students will be able to analyze the purpose and application of standardized knowledge and testing in American education and will be able to identify the positive and negative aspects of standardized education. Students will also be able to identify the differences between magnet school education and standard public education, along with understanding the relationships between student-centered instruction and magnet schools. So to begin with, I'll start off by analyzing the Chapter 19 Standardization and Control book review. It basically deals with outside controls for standardized testing, standardization versus standardized testing itself. It talks about the inequalities of standardized testing and how different measures have been put in place and basically different educational ideas have been tried in order to combat the inequalities that accompany standardized testing. One of the quotes that I found in the chapter that I actually liked states that the analysis presented here began with a selection of magnet schools as counterexamples to organizational de-skilling of teachers. These schools proved that schools can be organized in ways that do not put teachers in conflict with administrative purposes when they do their best teaching. They show that in a supportive environment, teachers will work alone and collaboratively to develop complex and up-to-date curricula, that they will tackle complex and controversial topics essential to their students' understanding, and that they will struggle to find ways to make learning possible for their students. So basically what the chapter review did was it analyzed standardization and control measures that are in place in public education and then offered counterexamples using magnet schools as the tool to basically describe how different elements have been put in place to counteract standardization and control policies that have been put in place by educational bureaucracy. So standardization in education, we have a brief history, controls on students, and controls on teachers. So the brief history for standardization in education basically came about because of the need to adequately and effectively measure students' performance in the American education system. And the federal government and state governments needed a way to analyze whether or not students were meeting the necessary requirements that they would need to graduate, and if teachers were basically producing effective and meaningful lesson material and curriculum that communicated the content and lesson objectives adequately and meaningfully. And then the controls on students, when you're talking about standardization, basically deals with their requirements to learn and demonstrate their understanding of content material or standardized material that's outlined in either the Common Core state standards for writing and literacy or the actual California content standards, in my case, for social studies. And the controls on teachers is pretty obvious because the teachers are confined to or regulated to teaching the material to prepare students for the standardized testing. So basically a lot of the curriculum and a lot of the developmental process of communicating lesson material all has to do with preparing students for standardized testing. So the controls on teachers in relation to standardization and standardized testing are pretty significant based off of the reliance on standardized material in secondary education. So standardized testing, there are certain information students have to know: science, math, history, and English. And in my opinion, these are 4 categories, and there are materials in these 4 content-specific categories that must be known. So English, for example, students must learn English because our science and math books are written in English. And then from the standpoint of history, in my American government and economics classes, the U.S. Constitution, amendments, and all legal language are written in English, so obviously English is something students would have to master. Science, math, and history are other examples. Science, there are certain elements such as evolution, which is a scientific fact. that students have to know and should know. And in order to basically ensure that the students perform these tasks well, I believe that standardized testing should and must be implemented, because if you look at the control set on schools from the local and state perspective, it's very parent controlled, and when parents control the content material for science and they're religious, they can conveniently live out the theory of evolution because it doesn't mesh well with their religious beliefs. So religious ignorance trumps educational rigor, and I believe that standardized testing and standardized information is a way to combat this problem. So when you're dealing with a pessimist and optimist perspective for standardized testing, a lot of people don't like standardized testing, primarily because of it. Basically, the grades from standardized testing encompass a lot of what the students will be basically assessed and graded upon. So a lot of people don't like that these tests are so heavily weighted and that the students must pass these tests in order to graduate. An optimist perspective, on the other hand, as identified by Phelps, who offered a defense for standardized testing, he outlines policies, implementation measures, common support, and then he also offers the debunking of common criticisms. So when you're talking about standardized testing and how standardized testing diminishes teacher performance, he basically asserts that if you take standardized material out of the equation, a poor teacher is still going to be a poor teacher. It is up to the teacher in the classroom to take the standardized content material and make it engaging and meaningful, and it's that way with anything in education. So basically, if the teacher wants to put in the time and effort, they can make standardized information meaningful and relevant. So standardization and educational bureaucracy, you have bureaucratic controls, and then standardization and bureaucracy's impacts on education. And this chapter dealt with a lot of basically the theory of bureaucratic controls and the relationship between standardization and bureaucracy. And it's important to understand that bureaucracy affects education in numerous ways. Myself as a teacher, I will have to interact with bureaucratic standards that are implemented within my district, and those bureaucratic controls differ from school to school and from different district to district. And it's important to understand that bureaucracy is real, it's there, and it's a big part of the educational process. And by understanding that and realizing that basically I will have to interact and butt heads with bureaucracy from time to time, it will make me less likely to get angry and frustrated, because I go into it knowing that, you know, bureaucracy and bureaucratic controls are something I should expect in education. And bureaucratic controls, especially when the chapter's talking about magnet schools, a lot of the bureaucratic controls are removed in the magnet school process in order to promote student engagement and then teacher facilitation, and then their ability to provide meaningful and reflective content material and basically create a fluid and interactive learning environment. So student-centered instruction versus teacher-centered instruction and standardization. When you're dealing with teacher-centered approaches to communicating standardized content material, this is the form of basically the teacher stands up, lectures on material, and so major vocab, ideas, and then major themes within a lesson or content objective. The teacher will stand up there. In my case, I usually use PowerPoints and notes to communicate complex ideas. I then use student-centered approaches to communicating standardized content material. So I take the ideas that I presented in my teacher-centered instruction and then turn it over to the students and allow them to develop. They're usually group projects that take more than one day. And my role is a facilitator, so I let the students use their the standardized knowledge for the content material that I communicated in the PowerPoint presentation, and then they demonstrate that knowledge through the group projects and activities that I provide for them. And within the chapter, and then all of the resources that I accumulated in the annotated bibliography, it puts a heavy emphasis on student-centered approaches to communicating the standardized content material, because it identifies the fact that student-centered approaches are oftentimes more meaningful. And the examples outlined in Chapter 19 regarding the magnet schools, they oftentimes utilize student-centered forms of instruction. And basically the chapter outlines that these means of communicating the standardized content material are extremely effective within the context of magnet schools, because they remove a lot of the bureaucratic and standardized controls and allow the teacher more freedom in the way that they actually conduct their classroom exercises, and allows the students more freedom and less stress in terms of accumulating and developing their understanding of the standardized content material that they will be tested on. So the problems with standardized knowledge, as we went through before, is that standardized knowledge is perceived different ways in different locations. Oftentimes, different cultures perceive things differently, and if you have one baseline, so if for history, for example, or in social studies in the form of economics, if you're using a standard form of, say, macro or microeconomics, that may be perceived differently on the East Coast as opposed to the West Coast. Or if you have immigrant students, they may come with a different understanding of what is considered standardized material. And the problem is basically dealing with the different perceptions and geographic locations, not to mention the fact that a lot of times teachers weigh students' grades heavily on the standardized content material and the tests. So these are just a few problems that accompany standardized testing and then controls as well. So when you're dealing with magnet schools, they took off in the 1980s, and they were implemented as a means to basically provide an alternative form of education, because the public school system was not working adequately. And it basically, what magnet schools do is they remove geographic boundaries so students can cross district lines in order to attend schools that specialize in something that the students are particularly interested in. So there are magnet schools that specialize in, creative development and science development, so on and so forth. And these magnet schools provide an alternative to the standard one-size-fits-all public form of education. So the carrot or the stick, I personally believe in using the carrot as opposed to the stick, so providing incentive as a form, or as opposed to punishment, using positive reinforcement as opposed to negative reinforcement, because students respond well to incentives. So one thing that I do is, if the students do a group project, then what I would like to do is that if they do a good job and everyone completes the project on time, I provide usually Panera or other form of food, I guess you could say, to kind of throw a party to say thank you for doing a good job. And what I'm doing now is I've introduced a debate candle to encourage my students to debate with one another regarding political issues. And then once the debate candle is burnt down to a certain point, I throw the students a party. So this is all to encourage the students to engage with the standardized content material that I provide to them. So choice versus control. If you look to the right, I provided this picture because I thought it sums up perfectly the main themes of Chapter 19, Standardization and Control. Because when you're talking about magnet schools and then elements of standardization and the controls implemented by bureaucracy, public education is more of a one-size-fits-all approach. And if you look, the girl, it's a little girl, it's just a plain old t-shirt, not necessarily appropriate for, female dress. And then if you look to your left, these students have access to different types of clothes, accessories, handbags, shoes. So what this basically says is that public education, if You have one shirt, and if it doesn't fit, then so be it. You have to make it work, as opposed to magnet schools that provide many choices that can be tailored and fitted to the.
Okay, so what is your name, content area, grade level, and some schools you have taught at?
Name is Jeff Brown. My content area is social studies, primarily government and economics, AP economics. I'm only taught at Chaffee High School. Do you need to know how long I've been teaching?
Or 26 years?
28 years.
28
Well,
years.
29 if you count in 1 year as an intern teacher, so 29 years.
29.
Primarily seniors.
Primarily seniors. So what is your position on standardized testing, and should teachers focus more on a student-centered approach or a teacher-centered approach?
I actually like standardized testing in conjunction with other measurements of achievement. I think that a standardized test by itself does not show learning exclusively. I do think if you take the results from a standardized test and combine it with work in other areas, I think you get a much better picture. But yeah, standardized test is what it is. It allows the teacher to compare, students, their effort, their level, and to some degree what they've been able to take from the class.
Okay. And do standardized tests affect your control in the classroom, and in what ways?
They do in advanced placement economics, absolutely. I have to keep on a rather rigid schedule of making sure that I have touched on all of the content areas that the exam would cover, that the students have at least mastered the writing or graphing skills necessary for the exam, and also to make sure that there's an opportunity for the students to demonstrate critical thinking, because the exam changes from year to year, and I guess I'm going off track from what standardized state testing is, but still I think it's important to point out that in advanced placement tests there are elements of questions that require critical thinking, so at some point in my instruction I have to build that in to the overall curriculum.
Okay. And in your opinion, are standardized tests fair and equal, and do you see a problem with the way information is perceived? So, like an example would be urban areas may perceive information differently than rural, more farm-oriented areas. Is that a problem in your opinion, or no?
First of all, I think standardized tests, by and large, diminish, or I should say, they don't take into account the backgrounds of the students that we have. As you well know, at Chaffee it's a Title I school. Many of our students have very little background, particularly in the social studies. So to judge them solely on knowledge and of their particular of the subject matter, I think is mistaken. We're not, we're saying, well, they don't understand economics or they don't get government. Having taught adult school government, I can say, there's some very capable people who just, because of their lack of exposure to what an average, normal, everyday, middle-class person would have opportunity to have access to, they're starting from behind. I like a standardized test that would measure growth and learning, which is difficult, but it would be nice. So lacking information would be, where are they starting? And I think that leaves us, we're not given pretty much a point with standardized testing of where the student is when they come into my classroom. So we can measure how they've gone from, let's say, absolutely zero knowledge of government to maybe they understand the 3 branches. And for them, that's an entirely new concept. Maybe they've gotten as far as federalism. Again, those are things that people who are middle class, grown up here in the United States, in a traditional family, probably come into their senior year understanding.
Okay. And so what is your opinion and background knowledge for magnet schools?
I know very little about magnet schools, but I am concerned because the establishment of magnet schools tends to favor those students whose parents are heavily involved in their education, in their overall life and development. I think that while I applaud that, I like to think I was that kind of a parent myself. That's not reality. Reality is that most of our students that we have at school have parents who either are caring for younger siblings, have to work themselves, or there are lots of other distractions. And so to segregate, because again, part of what we try to do in our with these students that we have, part of what we try to do is group activities, group learning. And part of this group learning is the opportunity of these kids that, let's say, don't have as much access to materials or information or knowledge and background to partner up with kids that do. And the kids that do at the same time kind of get an open eye, their eyes open as to, gee, wow, there's a girl that has to walk 3 miles to school every day. Here's a guy who has to work, and might be, late to class the next day because he worked till midnight or 1 o'clock. Gee, I didn't have to do any of that when I was in school. So, and it kind of, having been drafted, my point is school's the last bastion where basically social classes and economic classes can mix, and people can see, where other people come from.
So with that stance, do you think that the kids should be confined to certain districts? Meaning, so if you have Chaffee District, if they fall within a certain boundary, do you think that they are forced to go to that district, or if they have the opportunity to go to a better district?
I think they should stay in the school district. Now,
Okay.
In our high school district, we have 8 or 9, I believe we have 8 comprehensive high schools. Can they go with any of those high schools in our district? Yes, I don't see anything wrong with that. But we're talking about a large geographic area. Why should they leave that geographic area to go outside of it? No, I don't think they should. I mean, this is where they live. This is where they, this is their community. Whether they go to Chaffee, Ontario, or they go to Altaloma, or even Rancho, they want to drive that far, okay, but it's still our community. I don't think they should be leaving our community. I think that's wrong. And, if they're going to run away from reality, at what point are they going to finally have to stop and face what the rest of the world is like? You can't hide forever.
Absolutely. All right, well, Jeff Brown, thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right.
Again.
Here we go. So what is your name, content area, grade level, and schools you have taught at?
I'm Carrie Cohen. I teach history. I have 10th and 9th grade for Avid. I have taught at Rancho Cucamonga High School, Los Osos High School, and currently at Chaffee High School.
So what is your position on standardized tests, and should teachers implement a student-centered or teacher-centered approach for dealing with standardized testing?
I believe that it should be a student-centered approach to standardized testing. There's a lot of variables that come with each of the students, and those need to be accounted for. If we're expected to count them for our grades, and they should be accounted for in the standardized tests as well.
Excellent. Do standardized tests affect your control over what is learned in the classroom?
Absolutely, absolutely. The number one goal is to make sure we score well on the tests, and so I have to completely change what I want to do to make sure that I am covering the materials necessary to pass that standardized test, whether it's what I feel is important or not.
So do you see the state as, so all the standardized information with history, do you see standardized testing as a good thing or a bad thing?
I like that it gives me a general picture of how my kids are doing, but at the same time, I think there's certain variables with certain kids that need to be taken into account, like the parents work 2 jobs and they don't get to do their homework because they have to watch the younger kids. That should be definitely taken into account in the standardized testing if I have to take into account in my grades.
Okay, so in your opinion, are the standardized tests fair and equal, or do you see a problem with the way that they're being implemented based off of geographic location?
I would definitely say just look at the data. You'll see that socioeconomic, EL, geographic area definitely has variations in scoring versus different areas, and I'm not sure that it's very equal if consistently low socioeconomic areas don't do well. There's something wrong with the test then.
And what about magnet schools? Do you think magnet schools can deal with that in a coherent way? So dealing with the discrepancies in knowledge and the application and implementation of knowledge.
I think a lot of it depends on the students. I think some students will thrive in those types of schools, and some students not really. So it depends on the kid, really.
Should a student be confined to the district that they live in regardless of the school's performance, or should the student have the opportunity to cross district boundaries and attend a school of their choice?
Yeah, well, that's a tough one. Yeah, I think there should be some choice, especially if the parents have a very strong opinion about it. Then there should definitely be some leeway there. But I think for the most part, you should stay where you're from and stay with the kids that you've been growing up with, and you should probably go to the school you're destined to.
All right, thank you, Carrie.